As you can see, just preliminary title, the Paris Agreement and the European Union Performance and Implications. So what I'm trying to do is essentially two parts, and the first part is the actually longest part. The first part is assessing the Paris Agreement and outcome, and going through a number of dimensions, always looking at what the EU objective was and what's actually in the Paris Agreement and outcome. And obviously, we have all heard the words of an historic agreement, of a milestone, a breakthrough, etc. So you can make up your mind, hopefully, after that about it. Also about whether and to what extent the European Union has actually achieved its objectives in Paris and with the Paris Agreement and outcome. And when I say Paris Agreement and outcome, then that is for a reason. Because there's the Paris Agreement, and you've all heard about that, but there's also an accompanying decision of the Conference of the Parties. And actually, if you want to understand what was agreed in Paris, you will have to read both of them. And in the printout, as it's laid out right now, the COP decision is about 20 pages long, and the agreement, I think, 11 or 12. And a lot of what's being agreed is in the COP decision. And if you listen to the webcast and listen to the South African intervention after the adoption of the agreement, we will also hear that a lot of what's important for developing countries and for Africa and for South Africa is actually in the COP decision and not in the agreement itself. So it's a package of these two things, and here you see legal form and nature, long-term goal, differentiation, greenhouse gas mitigation, finance, transparency and accountability, technology and capacity building, adaptation and loss and damage. And that obviously does not even cover each and every single item that is in the agreement and in the decision. But it hopefully covers the main items, also the main items from a European perspective. And then I'll have a few selected observations and implications, a few thoughts that are obviously still relatively preliminary. We're not even 72 hours after the adoption of the agreement. A few thoughts at the end. Legal form and nature. The EU's objective in this area was, as you probably know, already from the beginning, actually already from 2007, 2005, to have a legally binding agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that would be applicable to all parties. It said in September that it wanted to have this agreement and a set of implementing decisions and as part of that agreement also quantifiable mitigation commitments by all parties. If we look at what we have in the Paris Agreement, we do have an international treaty under the UNFCCC. So very much the EU has achieved that objective of a legally binding agreement. And we have mitigation contributions by all parties. And we'll see when I talk about mitigation to what extent that is exactly what the EU wanted to have at the beginning. It's not really a set of implementing decisions. It's one implementing decision. And the EU certainly had hoped for more detail in these decisions, and we can come back to that in the individual items again. So overall, yes, there's the treaty that the EU wanted to have already for about a decade or so. The long-term goal, the first very important element also in the agreement, the EU objective was to have a long-term vision of global and sustainable climate neutrality and climate resilience in the second half of this century. That's at least the wording that you find in the Environment Council conclusions of September, spelling out the position of the EU for the Paris Climate Summit. And it has always been in favor of the below 2 degrees objective. What we got in the agreement, and that's one of the most well-known elements of it, is something that even goes beyond the below 2 degrees objective, well below 2 degrees Celsius with an opening for 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's not the wording. You find the precise wording in Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement, but that's kind of the idea. 2 degrees in any event, and hopefully even 1.5 only. And then the kind of climate neutrality element is expressed in somewhat more scientific language to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. So second half of this century remains Article 4.1, that is, and balance essentially means there should be no net greenhouse gas emissions. At least that would be my interpretation from then onwards. So some things will be absorbed, will be removed from the atmosphere. Some emissions may still go in there, and the net balance should be 0 at least. So if you see that, you could also, I think, come to the conclusion that it's not too far away from what the EU had envisaged. Differentiation, that's the old story of the difference that the Climate Change Convention has made between the so-called Annex 1 countries, the developed countries, and the non-Annex 1 countries, the developing countries, that has very much structured international climate policy and law for the last 25 years. And the EU objective, in line with the objective of most developed countries, was that there should be not this bifurcation anymore between developed and developing countries as regards commitments, and a more flexible concept of differentiation. Concept that more takes into account that there are differences between and among developing countries and between and among developed countries. And the Paris Agreement does that to some extent. It's definitely less bifurcation. There is a number of paragraphs where it's not said anymore, like developing countries do that, developed countries do that. But there are also still a few paragraphs where that is actually the case. So it's kind of halfway. There's still considerable differences between the treatment of both groups, but with more attention also being paid to national circumstances, different circumstances within these groups of countries. And that is cross-cutting across the different elements of the agreement, whether it's mitigation, whether it's transparency, so reporting and review, whether it's finance, etc. And if you want, we can go into detail, but just, I think, kind of partially achieved that objective on this dimension. Mitigation, the EU objective was to have quantifiable mitigation commitments by all parties, with an obligation, with a clear legal obligation to implement these mitigation commitments. Quantifiable could be different things for different countries, but it's something that you can measure, obviously. That was the idea behind it. Whether it's minus 40% greenhouse gas emissions as the EU itself has pledged, or whether it is perhaps decreasing or reducing greenhouse gas emissions against a business as usual scenario, or whether it's increasing renewable energy by a certain percentage. So quantifiable. Then there was supposed to be dynamic five-yearly mitigation ambition, a mechanism, a dynamic 5-yearly ambition mechanism for upward adjustment. So not downward, only upwards, only strengthening of commitments. The EU wanted to include international markets with a strong accounting framework so that it's clear when you're buying emission credits that these are real emission reductions, real additional emission reductions. And it also wanted to include international aviation and maritime transport in this agreement. One of the big points in the second week, actually, because, as we can see also here, that's that point, no inclusion of international aviation and maritime transport, so that was not successful. And then I just quoted for you essentially Article 4.1 on this kind of quantifiable mitigation commitments for everybody. Each party shall prepare, communicate and maintain successive nationally determined contributions that it intends to achieve. Parties shall pursue domestic mitigation measures with the aim of achieving the objectives of such contribution. Probably an S missing. So that was the outcome. Doesn't say it should be quantifiable. It's not very clear. It doesn't say each party shall implement, but it says parties shall pursue domestic mitigation measures. And you will forgive me if you are not lawyers, but this can mean different things. We're not quite sure yet, but it at least very clearly says that you should take action towards your mitigation contribution, as it's called. And then we have the 5-yearly review. Each party is to communicate mitigation contributions every 5 years on the basis of a 5-yearly stocktake also. And then if you read that together with the decision that I mentioned, then you have actually the first round again, 2018-20, where the mitigation contributions are reviewed, 23-25, and then it continues in principle every 5 years. So this element is in there. There's also the notion that it should be upward movement in the contributions, not downward. And there is inclusion of markets, emissions trading, and a kind of co-implementation mechanism. Those of you who know the Kyoto Protocol, there is the clean development mechanism in that Kyoto Protocol. It reads a little bit like a clean development mechanism 2, although it's not formulated exactly the same way. And the accounting for these is still to be elaborated. So kind of the goal of the EU was to have more substance there already, but the accounting with some principles defined in the agreement is still to be elaborated later on in mitigation. So overall, you can make your own judgment on to what extent the EU achieved what it wanted to have. Quite considerable, but also a few gaps in there. And as we're running through, I mean, there's always the comparison between the EU's objectives and what's in the agreement, but I hope you get a sense of what's in the agreement, because that might be what we are particularly interested in also. Finance. The EU objective was, if you look at it very broadly, to broaden kind of the framing of the finance debate. And there was kind of two or three elements. First, it was to broaden it so that there would be more countries contributing to climate finance, not only developed countries. Not only the developed countries defined in the convention, which is basically OECD countries. And that we would discuss financing in broader terms, also just of shifting investment, shifting the trillions, as it's then always said, not only these few billions that are moved around in climate finance, but actually the real investments in the real economy, that they go into climate-friendly investments, and enabling environments in recipient countries, that these are set up so that climate finance can be used most efficiently and most effectively. So that was kind of the framing that the EU was trying to get at. And obviously, yes, it's very sensitive, or rather avoid specific quantified legal commitments to climate finance, because that's very tricky in terms of budgets and parliaments. What do we have in the Paris Agreement? We have this sentence in Article 9.1, developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries, and a few more words follow. And then other countries are encouraged to also contribute. So kind of the broadening to bring in more contributors is kind of partially successful, I guess, because it's at least mentioned, was also hotly debated. And there's much more enhanced reporting on finance, on the provision as well as how it is, where it is received in developing countries, with details again to be elaborated. So what's actually missing a little bit is this kind of second element, that we need to change investments across the board worldwide. It's pretty much focused on the provision of public funding in that realm of finance. So that's perhaps a slight minus in terms of EU position, but also when you think about the problem of climate change, and that indeed these trillions, the big investments need to be shifted. That is not specifically mentioned. So that's the finance. Transparency and accountability. What's that about? That's obviously about whether we really get to know what countries are doing, whether they're implementing their commitments with respect to mitigation, but also finance. and whether there will be any follow-up of holding countries accountable. The EU's objective in that was to have a uniform, robust and rules-based reporting and review system for developed and developing countries with clear accounting methodologies. Again, a lot of this, the devil is in the detail, because you need to define how you count emissions, etc., so that is fixed, because you can game quite a bit with the rules and how you count, including should read for, not fair, the land use sector, where there's a lot of emissions, and it depends on how you count them, and removals, obviously. Depends on how you count them and how you account for them. How stringent then also your mitigation commitments are. And the EU wanted a compliance regime to promote implementation. What we have in the Paris Agreement is a uniform reporting and review system. Before we had a bifurcated system with a system for developed and a system for developing countries. We now have a more uniform system with flexibility for developing countries in light of their capacities. You can see there's some constructive ambiguity here, what that exactly might mean in Article 13. And we have a compliance and implementation committee that is being set up under Article 15. And we have for both elements that the details will be elaborated later. So we'll have to wonder then, when the details are elaborated, what this with flexibility for developing countries in light of their capacities exactly means. Is that for all developing countries, or does that actually imply only for those that have lower capacities? So some work to be done. But again, at least quite a reflection of the EU goals also in the outcome. Technology and capacity building, we can be a little bit briefer even. The EU objective, actually, if you look at the Council conclusions of September, you don't find a whole lot about technology and capacity building. Technology is actually now referred to as not only technology transfer, but also technology development and transfer. And one of the goals that the EU had was that they didn't really want to have new far-reaching frameworks and institutions, and as a side to that, no interference with intellectual property rights, which were under discussion at some point. There are a lot of institutions already out there that address technology development and transfer and capacity building. So the preference was there to be cautious and not create too many new ones. The Paris Agreement strengthens the existing institutional arrangements that are there, but it does also establish a Paris Committee on Capacity Building. Was again something that on the road to Paris became clearer and was discussed a lot, that many of the developing countries do face serious capacity problems. Sometimes these agenda items are considered as developing country agenda items and they want to get something out of it. But when you think about the challenge of climate change and what it entails to address it at national level in the developing countries, you need to build up national administration's capacity in there, but also in societies more broadly. So in that sense, it may make sense. There's this general notion that one will work on enhancing integration between all kinds of institutions that are out there already on capacity building and technology transfer, so that they really deliver the climate benefits, hopefully, that are required. You see that point down there? Further elaboration in the future. So that's something constant that you have across the agreement. Further elaboration of things later. And that's actually some parallel that you also have with the Kyoto Protocol. In the Kyoto Protocol of '97, we also had a kind of an agreement, and then on many, many points, the details need to be elaborated later. And we have a little bit the same here. A lot of work and the work program. Adaptation and loss and damage. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the agenda item of loss and damage, but that is the notion. Adaptation is probably clear. There are impacts to climate change, like rising sea levels, and you need to adapt. You may need to build dikes, etc. That's always the example, but there are also other ways. Loss and damage is more that the notion that some loss and damage will be incurred. And you may want to adapt to it, but it will just be gone. Some islands will be flooded, will be gone. Some areas may become inhabitable. It will just happen. So that has very much entered the international climate regime discussions. So the EU objective was to clearly establish adaptation as a second main pillar of international climate action. I think that was kind of agreed at the outset of the negotiations, that mitigation and adaptation need to be roughly on an equal footing. And then most developed countries wanted to avoid liability and compensation for loss and damage. Because if you accept that there's loss and damage, the next step is obviously that who's responsible for this loss and damage and who has to pay for it. So, and that's a tricky issue, because if you accept liability, then you may have to compensate, and that can be pretty expensive and also not really predictable of how expensive it would be. The Paris Agreement has an Article 7, so all the mitigation stuff is in Article 4, the adaptation stuff is in Article 7, with a global goal of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability, and relatively soft obligations. It basically establishes a cooperative framework for working collectively on the adaptation issue, not the same kind of obligations as on the mitigation side. And loss and damage is acknowledged in a separate article, but liability and compensation are specifically not included in the agreement. So it specifically says that you cannot base any claims for liability and compensation on this agreement. So, in that sense, also not too far away from the EU objective. And obviously also on adaptation you have several elements that will be elaborated later on. That brings me to a few thoughts, observations, and implications. First, on the EU side. Obviously, what the EU was facing throughout these negotiations was quite challenging internal and external framework conditions. On the external, international side, you had these already for the past 5 to 10 years, what's now referred to as the G2, the two big ones, the US and China, where the EU was afraid, and I think many other countries were also afraid, that they would just be squeezed between the two of them or by the two of them. It's not quite clear, so that there would be some kind of, that they would determine what the outcome would be. And actually, if you look at some of the declarations that China and the US have made over the past year and compare that to the agreement and the wording in there, you find some parallelism. So these are the two big poles, and that's difficult to stand up against them and try to influence things when they're two such big powers. And on the internal side, we all know there have been all these crises, economic, financial, etc., crises in the EU that haven't made it easier for the EU to address climate change. And there's quite a bit of internal diversity or divergence, depending on how you want to call it, differences of opinion, what to do about climate change also within the EU. So these are kind of difficult conditions when you look at it. But the EU has tried to respond. It has tried to, it was then in the news now in the conference, but I think the efforts are going on for much longer, and perhaps Olaf can tell us more about it later on, of shaping a high ambition coalition. That's what you would do in a situation where there's two big players, that you try to align with other smaller, medium-sized, whatever players, and try to build a coalition to influence things. I think we also should, when discussing the performance of the EU, and that's what the lecture series in the end is about, we should not only do what I did now today so far. Not only look at this was the EU position, this is the outcome, how much of it is reflected, how much of the EU position is reflected in the outcome. We should also look at the whole, at least 4 years of negotiations that were launched in Durban in 2011, and see what the influence during the process of the EU was. And when you do that a little bit, you actually get even a little bit more positive assessment. Because to start with, if you look at the negotiations in Durban that resulted in the Durban Mandate, which set up the whole negotiating process, that wouldn't have come about without the EU. The EU was asking for that. It was asking for this formula of a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention. So one has to give credit to that. All the climate plans that are on the table under the name of intended nationally determined contributions that have come about in the course of 2015 were agreed, was it Warsaw first, that they would be tabled? And that was a big fight, and obviously the EU was fighting for something even more quantified, etc., very precise ones. Not all the climate plans are now very precise. But again, I think it's fair to assume that without the EU pushing for that, we wouldn't have had the same kind of preparatory process that has now brought on the table more than 180 climate plans of the countries that are parties to the UNFCCC that cover more than 95% of emissions worldwide. So, and then you could go on with the other elements. The 5-year cycle, the EU may have wanted a more precise 5-year cycle, but again, it was very much the EU in the early days that was pushing for this 5-year cycle, saying the mitigation commitments will not be stringent enough, therefore we need a mechanism to ratchet them up. So I think one needs to take that into account. And the EU, I think that's also fair, again, Olaf may know more about that, in Paris was one of the main players. Also they're building this high ambition coalition, was one, not like in Copenhagen where the reports were that the other players were essentially making the deal and then the EU could change a few things at the fringes, but was heavily involved in the substance of the negotiations and one of the major players. Certainly not one of the G2, but that's how the world is. And then a little bit on the international framework. Just perhaps my take on it, and we can discuss it later on. It's certainly a historic milestone. One should be careful with historic, but I guess I will explain what I mean with that. I think it's important to just realize, and not everybody may realize that, who hasn't followed the negotiations for the past 10 or 20 years, that this agreement has overcome a very long-lasting principled stalemate in the negotiations. We have been sitting there for years and years and years and years and discussing this: developing countries, developed countries, developing countries, developed countries, Annex 1, non-Annex 1. And we can just hope also on the kind of the compromises that have been found in that agreement that stalemate has been overcome with that agreement. And it establishes kind of a new long-term framework for cooperation. So with these compromises found, there is now something in place that everybody can work with. We don't have all the pieces in place yet. I think that should be clear from the presentation, lots of to be elaborated, and 2018, next steps, etc. But there is this framework now, hopefully, that everybody can work on. So in that sense, historic and hopefully changing the history of international climate policy and how it will advance. Should also be aware that this is an expression of very high political and legal commitment to action, with all the heads of states that were there, with all the calls that have been going on between heads of state, with all the ministers, etc. I think that's in the background, and that needs to be exploited in the next steps. What's perhaps most remarkable, in addition, is that there's this clear signal and the clear direction that is given in the agreement of where we are going, and that signal is going to climate policy at all levels, not only at the international level, but this kind of phase out of greenhouse gas emissions that we're going to a decarbonized world should be very clear from Article 4.1, and that one should realize that will have very severe implications for our future economic and technological development and how the world will be structured and where the business opportunities are, etc. And again, we can discuss that perhaps later on. So now, next steps, implementation at all levels and by all actors. That's the focus in the next step, to respond to and reinforce that signal. Because when then the international community comes back in 2018 to discuss the next steps, we should be in a position to say, actually, we have made so much progress at all the other levels. that we can think about strengthening the international targets and further elaborating the framework so that it can help the actors at the other levels to make further progress in the next step. So that's kind of the vision, and I think that's how at least I see the international framework that has been agreed upon less than 72 hours ago. Thanks very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we hopefully will have later on.
I mean, what I'm trying to do in the next, let's say, 15 minutes to give you a little bit an insight from a European foreign policy perspective in how I was involved in that. I mean, as Katja said, I'm working in the European External Action Service, which is the foreign policy branch of the European Union. And over the last, let's say, 12 months, I was involved with colleagues in what we call climate diplomacy. So what I'm trying to do is basically look a little bit at the past, as the kind of guiding questions also indicated, on the EU's climate diplomacy efforts, explaining how the European External Action Service has played a role in raising awareness and encouraging actors. Then at the present, what actually happened in Paris, and I'll be happy to share some of the, let's say, elements and with that, and then let's say in the end to give a little perspective into the future, what we need to do next. And then I'm, as Sebastian also said, very much looking forward to the discussion, and I'll be willing to be contradicted by you and have a discussion on the different elements that I'm going to present. So let's say, to start with the past, the EU's climate diplomacy efforts. So basically, if I look at the whole question of European climate diplomacy, I would say it's one of the big examples where European diplomacy actually works, because you have a lot of other areas where the actual cooperation between the EU level and the member states is much more fractious, much more tensions, as you know, in many areas, from migration to financial issues and all that. But basically what we are dealing with and what we tried over the last, let's say, 12 months and already before, but I've been involved in the last 12 months, is to mobilize this diplomatic network. And when we speak about the diplomatic network, it's basically the world's largest diplomatic network. If you count all the embassies and delegations of member states in the EU level, you have 3,000 embassies and delegations, and they employ like 90,000 diplomats. So let's say this is the big picture, and we tried to mobilize them. I won't pretend that we managed to mobilize all 3,000 delegations and embassies and all 90,000 diplomats, but I'll give you some examples how over the year we mobilized them, and this was then part of the process, and also I would say why the EU was perceived as one of the major players in Paris. So how did we mobilize this network, and what was our mandate? I mean, as Sebastian referred to some of the kind of council conclusions, beginning of 2015, we had basically a foreign affairs council where the foreign ministers of the EU got together and decided on a climate diplomacy action plan, where we kind of outlined on 2-3 pages what the EU should do in light of the upcoming climate conference in Paris, where everybody said, okay, if we want to get a deal in Paris, we need to mobilize our diplomatic network, because that's where we're the closest to the 190, not totally because there's part of the EU, but the 160 other countries with whom we need to negotiate this international agreement. So this is a little bit let's say, the framework we were acting in, and then it was basically the EU Foreign Policy Service that I'm working for, and then of course all the services in the Commission, which is mainly DG Klima, but also then the respective EU presidencies, and I come a little bit to this kind of triangle, the cooperation between the different parts of the EU house on that, and which is probably also then, as you said, like on the EU performance in multilateral negotiations. So let's say some of the successes we had in 2015 was we did a lot of high-level outreach, démarches, and public diplomacy. So when we speak about high-level outreach, it was basically we tried to push in all the bilateral talks. For example, if the High Representative of the EU, Ms. Mogherini, or the Commission President or commissioners were meeting with their counterparts, to always include an element of climate change. Of course, it was to different extents. Sometimes it was kind of trade-based relations, but always to kind of push this issue of climate change into the discussions. Of course, we were helped by, let's say, a global awareness of the importance of the subject, and it was all over through the year in the media, which facilitated it, and there was also, like, a high receptiveness from some countries, not from all. So sometimes we needed to push more. And via thus, we mobilized, let's say, many of our diplomats on this. Then another kind of concrete example we did was a European Climate Diplomacy Day in June this year, where we mobilized. It was basically an initiative by Germany and France and the UK, just to say also it's not just the EU level here from Brussels, where we said, okay, the idea is that all our delegations organize events on a specific day to kind of mobilize the world around the topic of climate diplomacy, and this took place in 50 countries together with member states' embassies, and thus we mobilized, let's say, hundreds of missions, delegations, embassies, if you count the whole EU network together. Then throughout the year there was global European climate diplomacy ranging from Colombia to Korea. Just to give you an idea, just in the days before Paris, there were like climate marches all around the world. I mean, there was, I think, one planned here in Brussels that because of the security situation then unfortunately didn't take place. But there was, for example, one happening in Korea, in Seoul, and there our EU ambassador and some other ambassadors joined this climate march to show that they're also interested in the subject. Or in Colombia, there was a so-called climate train, the train to Paris. Of course, it didn't go all the way from Colombia, Bogota to Paris, but as an activity in the country. So they were very much involved also in public events. Then what does all this means? I mean, I'll also come then a little bit, what is the outcome of Paris? But even, let's say, without that, it shows that multilateralism is actually working. And I think this is also very, very important in the larger framework, not just dealing about climate change, because it's basically the whole world came together in Paris. As Sebastian also said, we're speaking about 196 parties. At some point, there were 40,000 people in Paris, and then in different layers involved in the overall negotiations. You had, I think, roughly 3,000 to 6,000 journalists. You had plenty people all around the world involved in that. But basically having an agreement in the end shows that even with a very cumbersome, long multilateral process, you can achieve things on the global scale. Basically finding global solutions to global problems, which sounds very nice, but if you see the whole process, it's very difficult and delicate. But I think it's very important also in the 70th year of the United Nations to show that there is a value of kind of global governance that delivers on these issues. And there again, I mean, the EU has its share and its part, but as working as a kind of a global community. Then also what is I think important, and I'll give some examples from the actual negotiations, is that the EU is leading by example, which is, I mean, if you do climate diplomacy and outreach, you also need, if you want to be consistent to the outside, you need to be consistent in the inside. So it's basically that we worked in a kind of mini lateral fashion on consensus among our 28 member states plus the EU level, so let's say 29 actors, and that worked very well on climate change. I don't want to say that there were no differences, and this you saw in the media, were very different positions within the EU, ranging from, to name a few, from Poland to Germany and some of the other major players, but there was, let's say, an overall consistency. And I think this is also to come a little bit what happened in Paris, which was different. I mean, I wasn't myself in Copenhagen, but basically what I was told that in Copenhagen at some point you had roughly, let's say, 10 different voices for the EU speaking. So you had the EU Commission, you had certain member states, and then some of the other major actors said, okay, who is the EU, with whom should we speak? You might want to come in then later and give some details on that. But this is something, when you look now what happened in Paris, the overall consistency of the EU was very much kept. I mean, we had our internal discussions among EU ministers and the Commission, but this was one of the, I would also say, successes. What happened in Paris is that when the EU went to the outside, there was a strong voice of the EU Commission together with the Luxembourg presidency representing the member states, and then member states followed that line. So this was, let's say, one of the things. Then on the other thing, what happened in Paris, we had the leaders segment at the very beginning. And there again, speaking about climate diplomacy, it's partly also the people that were involved. So you had the, let's say, the top level of the EU, you had the Commission's President Juncker, you had the Council President Tusk, and you also had Ms. Mogherini, who is the High Representative for Foreign Policy, being there on the very first day, being at that high-level segment, delivering a speech, and then having bilaterals, as often is the case in these multilateral frameworks. So then the other thing why I would say it's a European success, I think it's very important also to actually look at the French COP presidency on that, because one is to speak about Europe as part of the negotiator, but in the end it happened in Europe, it happened in Paris, and in comparison to the last one that most people remember as Copenhagen, which also happened in Europe, which left a kind of a bitter aftermath that basically in Europe you cannot come to a deal. I'm simplifying. So I think this is also then a success, and this is basically thanks to the French diplomacy, to Laurent Fabius as let's say the COP president and his diplomatic skills and of the French network. But I think if you look at Europe a little bit wider, not just as the EU institution, it's also a European success of having done all this shuttle diplomacy from a French perspective, involving all their embassies around the world in this issue. Then another kind of success was also what Sebastian was already pointing to, was this coalition for ambition, which was, to my understanding, something that very much crystallized in the last days, because it was also something that was always asked for, partly taken for granted, that the EU would be ambitious. But the question is, in how far can you take other countries with you? And I think this is also a process that built up throughout the year by knowing what is important for other countries, where are their kind of red lines, where might they show some flexibility also from our side. So this coalition for ambition, which was basically then the European Union, its member states, a lot of the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, but then we also managed to get the US, Brazil and others, a totality of 100 countries on board, which put, let's say, a very strong bloc, which was there for ambition. Because on the other side you had before, and even in the first week in Paris, still a very kind of strong bloc, and that's a little bit about the changing alliances throughout the process, which was the G77 in China, who was always kind of speaking out and all that. And if you look in the last days in Paris, there was no mentioning anymore of G77 and China. So that, I would say, was also a success from the EU to kind of bring a big coalition of countries behind you. And then, as I mentioned, the other dimension was the kind of EU internal machinery on working closely together between us as a kind of foreign service, the DG Klima with all their kind of technical experts that were on the ground in Paris, the feedback to our delegations around the world by kind of constantly providing them with information, getting information for them, the Luxembourg presidency, who did a very good job in kind of federating all the different member states, taking their considerations on board, being very transparent in what they were doing together with the Commission, who were kind of in the lead. So none of the member states had the feeling they're excluded, because with that you would risk kind of breaking the overall coherence. And I think that is important to say, okay, the EU is appearing as a kind of consistent actor to the outside, so a united front. And that was done at the kind of technical level in the first week, the negotiators level, and until the very end in the political level. So now, I mean, where does all that lead us and brings us? So that is, let's say, what does the Paris Agreement mean for the future of EU climate diplomacy? It's partly now, of course, about implementation, and now, like, let's say 72 hours, as you said, afterwards, we're still kind of digesting it, analyzing it. What does it actually mean in concrete terms? But a couple of things are very clear. So one is that we will continue our climate diplomacy into 2016, working closely with the member states, with the Commission, the EES, with the upcoming presidency, which will be the Netherlands, working via our delegations and our network of diplomats all around the world. I think one of the major things, is, without going too much detail, is of course this intended nationally determined contributions, to see how what now states all around the world said they will deliver on CO2 emission reductions. How do you actually put that into place? How can the EU and member states support them in being ambitious on these things? Then also there will be definitely attempts by some parties to roll back So which we've seen also from Kyoto and all that. So how can we counterbalance that in ongoing negotiations, in our outreach, in kind of our diplomatic contacts? And then also in practical terms, we had in July this year a Foreign Affairs Council and where we had conclusions where basically we were asked as our High Representative Ms. Mogherini and the Commission to report back early 2016 on what we're planning next, what are the implications of what happened in Paris for EU climate diplomacy and EU policies. And so this is basically where, let's say, beginning of next year, we will kind of take stock, come back to the Foreign Affairs Council and suggest what we will do. And I think at that stage I would stop here, and then I'm very much looking forward to our discussion, your questions, and I'll be happy to give more details, examples and all that. So thanks a lot.